Hey class, welcome back to week 3. We're going to be talking about some fun stuff. This is going to be a long video. I'm going to put timestamps on it. I'm going to talk kind of fast and go through things. But remember, just a pro tip for you, when I put this up on YouTube, you can go into YouTube settings while watching this video and you can slow down the playback speed. And remember, you can always pause it. This is a fun week. This is probably the most important week of the whole term because we're really going to be diving into the technical aspects of photography, and we're going to be learning your camera and how light interacts with it. All right, so grab some coffee, grab a drink, grab some food if you want to, and let's go ahead and dive in. Hopefully you've got your camera with you. As we go over things, you can go ahead and go onto your camera. We're going to be talking about shutter speed, ISO, and aperture a lot from here on out, almost every week, okay? So it's really important for you to find out how to change those settings on your camera for your make and model. All cameras are different in that aspect. I will say, for the most part, that universally, if you have a dial on the back of your camera, like a thumb dial, where your thumb typically should go, that is typically the setting to change your shutter speed, okay? Now, I have a lecture that I'm going to go through, and I'm going to jump around on it. But we're talking about exposure and light, and what is a proper exposure. With our cameras, we are trying to get a proper exposure. And remember, we're doing everything manually here, okay? Before we get into that, I want to explain a little bit how light works and how it interacts with your camera. Light comes in, let's say you're taking a photograph of a landscape, okay? The light will come in through the lens, it will go through an aperture, and we'll talk about that in a second. This entire encasement here, this entire body is called your lens, but inside you have your actual lenses. And then when the light comes in, or the image that you're aimed at, it comes in and it's going to hit the reflex. This is a diagram of a DSLR, which stands for digital single lens reflex. That reflex is this mirror right here. It's a flip up mirror. So when you're getting ready to take your photograph and you press your shutter button, this mirror flips up out of the way. You can see the little diagram right here. This mirror flips up out of the way, and this image that you're going to take bypasses that. It goes past your shutter, because when you press your shutter release, your shutter opens and then it will close, and then the image hits the sensor on the back where it is recorded onto your SD card. Okay, now this is a DSLR camera. That image comes in, it hits the mirror so that we can view it. It goes up into a pentaprism. It bounces here, and it comes out the viewfinder on the back of your camera where your eye is. You're looking through it. That's how we can see what we're looking at through the lens. If you're using a mirrorless camera, it's totally fine, but you do not have this aspect to your camera, nor this aspect to your camera, okay? Now, we talked about an aperture, the light coming through, it's going to pass through that aperture first. Down here, there's just a quick little diagram. Aperture, the definition is a hole or an opening or a gap, okay? So on your camera, all lenses are different, and there's really nice lenses that you can open it up to 1.4. Typically, some newer lenses, just starting out, you can't go beyond f4 or f5.6 with it, okay? Now, when we talk about aperture, we also talk about a word called f-stop. When we say f-stop, the F stands for focal length, and I'm not going to dive into that and geek out on it. If you really want to do it, you can, but I don't want to confuse anybody with the deep definitions of things. Just know that this number represents an opening for the aperture, okay? So if I were to tell you to set your camera to f16, This is the amount of light, or this is the size of the hole that the light is passing through. Very small hole, okay? Not a lot of light passing through it. Just know this is the diagram for that. Let's go back and talk about a proper exposure. Down here you can see I wrote a perfect exposure. This is a pair of Chuck Taylors I shot for Converse. When we say overexposed, it's too bright. It's pretty self-explanatory. Something that is underexposed, meaning it's too dark. Sometimes you're going to take a photograph and it's going to be pitch black. Make sure your lens cap is off first. Sometimes it's going to be too dark. We're going to go into that and figure out how to make a proper exposure this term. If you keep going through this lecture, which is up on Canvas, this is called the exposure triangle. And what this does, it kind of allows you to look at things and know what's going to happen. You can see the aperture, which we just talked about. The larger the aperture, the brighter your image will be. Also down here, you've got your ISO and your ISO settings. ISO is an acronym. Don't worry about what it stands for. And I'm going to get into how that works with photography here. And then your shutter also, you can see the labeling for shutter speeds. 1/1000th of a second. This is in a fraction. I'm not teaching math, but just know that shutter, this is in a fraction. So 1/1000th of a second is a really fast shutter speed, okay? Now let me try to explain some of this to you. Like I said, think of it in terms of your human eyes. The shutter speed are your eyelids, okay? If you blink really fast, you have a really fast shutter speed. If you keep your eyelids open, your eyelids stay open, you're allowing more light to come through. Your image is going to be brighter, okay? Your aperture is your pupil, okay? It's going to dilate. It's going to open up or it's going to shrink down. Your pupil opens, it allows more light to come through, or it needs to get more light. And when it closes, less light, right? Your ISO is the retina, the cones inside your eye. That is the sensitivity to the amount of light that is coming through. Does that make sense? So the aperture is the amount of light going through the opening. The ISO is the sensitivity to that light that comes through. So in everything that we're doing, we're trying to get a proper exposure. And by doing that, every single time we take a photograph, we're going to have 3 options to choose from. We can change all 3 of these settings we want, the aperture, the shutter, the ISO. We could just change one. We could change 2 of them, whatever. That is our creative decision. That is our freedom to choose depending on the effect that we want to get. The very first real assignment here, we're talking about assignment 3, shutter speed. We're going to have 2 parts to it. You're going to show motion and you're going to stop motion. The shutter speed has 2 functions. It shows motion and it stops motion. When you use a really fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a shutter speed, that's a really fast shutter speed. Okay, really fast. Athletes, if you want to stop that motion, use a really fast shutter speed. When you move down to 1/8 of a second, very slow shutter speed, you are going to show that motion. And I'm going to show you guys a technique, and we're going to create some really cool photographs, and I hope you guys enjoy this assignment. Down below this, I have another diagram for you guys to look at. It might help. You're going to notice with the aperture and assignment 4, depth of field. We're going to be talking about assignment 4 next week, but this is the effect that you're going to get depending on which setting you choose. You'll notice f32. Some of your lenses can't go to f32 or f1.4. Don't worry about that. Just know that, any one of these settings will get you close enough. But you'll notice here, f32, the effect you're going to get is that the person standing and the mountain in the background, it's all sharp. It's all in focus. If you come way down here to f1.4, you'll notice that the person is sharp and in focus, but the background is blurry. And that's how you get those really beautiful, sharp focused portraits with that nice fall off the blurry background, okay? We've got ISO, kind of the effect of what's going to happen with the ISO. A low ISO versus a high ISO, like 51,000, 12. Some of your cameras can only go to 12,800, but you'll notice these like little dots in there. That's called noise. And we typically don't want to have noise in our photographs, okay? So just keep in mind what happens when you increase your ISO. If you increase it too much, you might start to get noise in your images. And then once again, down here, we've got our shutter speed, and you can see the effects of that. This next slide, I want to talk to you about our light meter. Our cameras have a built-in light meter that it meters the amount of light coming through, and it actually is, they're trying to help us and let us know if we're about to take a proper exposure. This is your viewfinder. This is an image of the viewfinder. This may not be exactly your viewfinder because all cameras are different, remember. And this is the LCD screen. But this right here, you'll notice here on the viewfinder, this area and this circled area here, this is called your light meter. When you, down below your light meter, you've got a little dot. Can you see this little thing that I'm actively blocking? Okay. That little symbol, that little notch, is going to change. It's going to either go to the right or it's going to go to the left, depending on your camera settings and how you change your camera settings. Once it's right in the center of it, in the center of here or the center of here, your camera is letting you know that you are going to take a proper exposure, okay? So that's what that light meter is. Get used to finding it and using it, because every time you take a photograph, this will help you determine if your photograph is going to be overexposed or underexposed. This next slide, I'm going to teach you guys a little cheat sheet. It's called the Sunny 16 rule. And what the Sunny 16 rule states, though, is that if you were to walk outside at 12 o'clock noon on a perfectly sunny blue cast day, you could set your aperture to f16. That's why it's the Sunny 16 rule. If you were to set your aperture at f16, whatever you put your ISO at, if you put your shutter speed at the same exact setting, you will get a proper exposure. That's the rule. So 12 o'clock, sunny day, f16. If you put your ISO at 200, your shutter speed will be at 1/200th of a second. If you put your ISO at 400, your shutter speed will be 1/400th of a second. Okay? Now, it gets complicated when the clouds start to come in. If it's kind of partly cloudy, there's going to be less light in the sky. So f16 to f11, that is our aperture here. We're talking about the Sunny 16 rule. We started at f16. We went over that on a sunny day. Now we're moving into a slightly cloudy day. We have to change our aperture to f11. What did we do with our aperture? Go ahead and think about it for a second. From f16 to f11. Right? We opened up our aperture, and you could go back to that slide earlier. So from f16 to f11, we opened up the opening to allow more light to come in. So if we set it at f11, we could still go ahead and put our ISO at 100th and our shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, and we'll get a proper exposure. Same down. I won't go over every single one because it's pretty obvious and self-explanatory. On an overcast day, totally overcast, it's all clouds in the sky, you have to go from f11 to f8, open up your aperture more to allow more light to come in. And during sunset or sunrise where there's very little light, you could go to f5.6 and use the same strategy. ISO 100, shutter speed 100th, walk out, and you would get a proper exposure. That's just a quick cheat sheet. If you wanted to go out and start taking photographs you could go ahead and just do that really quickly. The next part of this video, we're going to be talking about exposure equivalencies. It's very, very important to understand exposure equivalencies. What is a stop? We're going to be talking about whole stops versus 1/3 stops, and changing your camera settings using the dials or the settings on the camera. And then I want you guys to go ahead and practice. Now, a stop. A stop, in photography, it's terminology. We're kind of learning a new language here, okay? So when I say a stop, I'm talking about a unit that measures the change in exposure values, such as the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO, okay? Think of this. When you make a click on your camera's dial, like the shutter speed, when you turn that dial, when you click it one click, you're changing the exposure value. You're changing the exposure value by 1/3 of a stop. What is a stop? A unit that measures the change in exposure values. When you make 3 clicks on that shutter spot, on that dial back there, 1, 2, 3. I wrote it down here. Told you it's not a math class, but you got to do some fractions here. 3 of those 1/3, 3/3 equals 1 equals a whole stop, okay? Which is right here. This is a stop. Going back to demonstrate, from F16 to F11 is one whole stop of an exposure value. I actually have it up on Photoshop, and I'm going to start talking about it here in a second. Just know that you can change the exposure values with the aperture. You can change your exposure values with your shutter speed and your ISO. What I'm going to talk about here is kind of important. So take some notes if you can. Go slow, go over it. Right here, we're going to see our shutter speeds. This is a little diagram, and this is the settings that you could probably change your shutter speed to. Your camera has the ability to do most of these. It might not be able to get up to 1/8,000th of a second, but you should be able to get to 4,000th of a second. This is shutter speeds. Continue here. Over here, we've got our f-stops. What is f-stop? Aperture. Those two words are linked interchangeably. When I talk about f-stop, I'm talking about the aperture, the opening. Over here, we've got our ISO and our settings over here. You'll notice that each one of these has the whole stop value, the whole increment value of the exposure, and it also has the thirds, right? You can change your ISO in thirds value by clicking it once. If you click it twice, that's 2/3. Then you click it again, 3/3. So let's go over assignment 3, motion. On this assignment, I'm going to have you guys stop motion and I'm going to show motion. Have creative freedom in this. It's up to you guys as to what you want to do. If you can capture a bird in flight, something like that, that would be a lot of fun. So let's say we go outside and it's 12 o'clock noon. We're going to use the sunny 16 rule to start, okay? So what do we put our f-stop at 12 o'clock noon? Our f-stop, which is our aperture, we set that at f16. Now, the sunny 16 rule states whatever we put our ISO at, we can put our shutter speed at. So we put our ISO at 100th. We come over here to the diagram. Shutter speed, there's not a 1/100th shutter speed as a whole stop. It's actually one of the 1/3 of a stops. So we're going to put our shutter speed at 1/100th, our ISO, and 16th. Boom, we're going to get a proper exposure. Okay. Now, for this assignment, motion, we're talking about the shutter speed. The shutter speed of 1/100th that we just chose, it's somewhere in between here. This does not show motion very well. So we want to set our camera setting down to like 1/8 or 1/4 of a second if we can. For this assignment, 1/15th or even 1/30th will work. Let's go ahead and choose 1/30th. You can feel free to practice slower shutter speeds down the road. But let's say to show motion, we're going to stop motion and we're going to show motion, okay? Stop in motion, we're going to want 1/1000th of a shutter speed. And to show motion, we're going to want 1/30th of a second for a shutter speed. Now let's go back. Let's stop motion first. Right now we're talking about exposure equivalencies. Equivalent, okay? Try to think of that. They're equal. If I have a perfect exposure at f16, my ISO is at 100, and my shutter speed is at 100, that's a perfect exposure. But to stop motion, I know I need a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a shutter. Okay? That means I'm making a change from 100. When we talk about stops, we talk about whole stops, but we have to click it in thirds, okay? So on our camera dial, to get from 1/100th of a second to 1/1000th of a second, every time we click a dial, we're doing 1/3 of a stop. So we're going to go 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks. That's one whole stop. So from 1/100th to 1/200th is one whole stop. We're going to go 1 more click, 2 more clicks, 3 more clicks. That's another whole stop. We just went from 100 to 400. That's 2 whole stops. And then we're going to click the dial again, click the dial again, click the dial again. That's 3 whole stops. And then we're going to click the dial one more time. So it's 3 1/3 stops. Now, if we did not change these values over here, what would happen to our photograph? Think about that for a second. So ask ourselves what we did to the shutter speed. We went from 1/100th of a shutter speed to a really fast shutter speed, very fast. What happens when we increase the shutter speed? Go back to the exposure triangle, okay? We went from 1/100th, which is around here somewhere. We went from here to 1/1000th of a shutter speed. This will tell you what's going to happen. So it's going to get less bright, which if we were to take the photograph right now, it would make our photograph darker. We have 2 options over here, the f-stop and the ISO, to change that. We need more light, right? Because increasing the shutter speed just made our image darker. So we have 2 options. The f-stop from f16, which is a very small opening, we could increase the opening of that, or we could come to our ISO and we could bump our ISO up. The ISO is one of those things that you should change last, because if you have to bump your ISO up, there's chances that you might get noise or that grainy look, which is not good, okay? So let's go ahead and go to our f-stop. We're going to make changes to this, and we have to come back. We made 3 1/3 of a stop, right? Each one of these clicks, each one of these terrible squiggly little lines is 1 click on your dial. 3 of those clicks is 1 whole stop. So we did that 9 times to get to 3, and then we had to make 1 more click to get to 1/1000. So it's 3 1/3 of a stop. So let's come to our f-stop. We're going to have to make a change to our f-stop that is equivalent to 3 1/3 of a change. Go ahead and take some time, pause the video, look at it, and you tell me what f-stop you think would be an equivalent exposure. All right, let's go ahead and go through this and see if you're right. So we're going to go from f16. Every time we click the dial on for our aperture here, we're going to go 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks. That's 1 stop. 1 click, 2 click, 3 click. That's 2 stops. 1 click, 1 click, 1 click. We're at 3 stops. So we made one more third and we came to f5.0. Okay, so now we've got our new settings right here. Our shutter speed is at 1/1000th of a second. Very fast. We're trying to stop motion. And our f-stop is at f5.0 and our ISO is at 100. We should have a proper exposure if this is 12 o'clock noon, right? I encourage you guys to get out. The worst time of day to take a photograph is when the sun is really bright, when it's really bright outside. Here in Bend, I mean, that could be like 9 a.m. in the morning until like 7 o'clock in the afternoon, right? But find those really nice golden hour types during the day. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but down the road I will. And just know that harsh light does not create flattering images, okay? This next part of the assignment, we're going to show motion. We need a slow shutter speed. I want you guys to think of a really slow shutter speed. Go back to that diagram. I'll go ahead and go there for you. Let's use this one here. I said 1/30th. Let's try to get to 1/15th just for this assignment. Think of what happens when a slow shutter speed. You can go to the exposure triangle. 1/15th of a second. 1/15th of a second is right here. Brighter. The arrow, right? 1/15th. That means your image is going to be really, really bright, especially if you're out there at 12 o'clock noon. So let's go back to our equivalencies. Let's start from the beginning. I encourage you guys to do this later in the evening, even like right at sunset, unless you're an early morning person, right when the sun is about to come up. This will be a lot easier to do. Later on in the afternoon, it's going to be very hard, and I'll demonstrate right now as to why. Let's say you walk out there at 12 o'clock noon. It's bright, it's sunny, it's beautiful, right? We're going to set our camera to f16. We're using the sunny 16 rule. That means whatever we set our ISO, we can set our shutter speed. Let's go ahead and put our ISO at 100, and we're going to come over and put our shutter speed at 1/102. That means we're going to have a proper exposure. On this part of the assignment, we want to show motion. What was the setting to show motion? 1/15th of a second, okay? So we go to our shutter speed, and we know that we need 1/15th of a second. 1/30th, somewhere around there will be fine. For this assignment, let's go ahead and use 1/15th of a second. So from 1/100th of a second, we're going to make one click on the dial, another click on the dial, another click on the dial. That's 1. Another click on the dial, another click on the dial, another click on the dial. That's 2. And another click on the dial, and another click on the dial. That is 2/3. So our exposure equivalent is 2 2/3 of a stop. That's the equivalent that we just made. We have to go back over here and make a change to one of these so that we get a proper exposure. Now, let's think about what we just did to our shutter speed. We went from 1/100th of a second to 1/15th of a second. Is that faster or slower? It's slower. So we went from 1/100th to 1/15th. More light coming through, right? More light means that we need to come over here. If we were to take this exposure right now, it would be overexposed. So that means we have to come over to either our f-stop or our ISO and lower the amount of light coming through. Think about how to lower the light for the f-stop and think about how you lower light for the ISO. Go back to that triangle if you want to and take a look. In order to lower the light with our f-stop, we would need to go from f16. We would need to make that opening even smaller. To lower the ISO, to make less light come in using the ISO, we would have to go to 100. We would have to go lower than 100. Most of your cameras can't go lower than 1/100th. Can't go lower than 100. So that means we have to go back to our f-stop. Our f-stop, that means we need to make a change of 2 2/3 to our f-stop to get an equivalent exposure. So let's go ahead and run this down. We need to make this smaller, so we're going to go a larger number, smaller opening. F16, we're going to make one click at a time. 1, 2, 3, that's 1. 1, 2, 3, that's 2. And we got to go 2 more clicks, which your lenses probably cannot get to. That means it is impossible for you to get a proper exposure at 12 o'clock noon with a shutter speed of 1/15 at ISO 100 trying to show motion. You can't do it. We need less light. We need less light. So we can't look to our settings on our camera. We have to actually look to the light source, which is the sun. That means we need to take a photograph when there's less light up in the sky. An overcast day would work, or when the sun is really low on the horizon. Either one of those would work. Does that make sense? If you cannot do this, then you need to find a way to make a change somewhere else, and usually that is looking towards the light source. All right, let's go ahead and run through this again, but let's pretend that we went out and it's like 7 o'clock. The sun is lower to the horizon. Maybe it's partly cloudy. Per the F16 rule, on a partly cloudy sky, we could set our aperture to 5.6. Remember, f-stop is aperture. Same thing. And Sunny 16 rule states that whatever we set our ISO to, we can set our shutter speed. Now we know that we want a shutter speed of like 1/15. Unfortunately, ISO is not, we don't have a 1/15 ISO. So to begin, let's go ahead and do this again. We're going to set our ISO to 100. We're going to come over here and shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. So at 7 o'clock, it's slightly overcast, cloudy, whatever. Then this should get you close to having a proper exposure. Anytime you do this, just remember this is just a guideline. This will get you close. Once you get out there and you take this photograph, if you were to go out there and take this photograph and it was too dark, what would you have to do? You have 3 options every time. Remember, every time you take a photograph, you have 3 options as to what you can do. You could slow your shutter speed down to allow more light in. You could increase your aperture, making the opening larger, like f4, 2.8. Or you could bump your ISO up to 200, 400. Even one of the 1/3 stops is fine. There's multiple options. If you went out and took this photograph and it was too bright, you would just do the opposite, right? So let's go ahead and just, as an example, let's pretend that we went out 7 o'clock. It's partly cloudy. Our aperture is at 5.6, Sunny 16 rule, ISO 100, shutter speed 100. Now, we're trying to show motion on this assignment, and we want that 1/15th of a second. 1/30th, 1/15th, somewhere around here will be totally fine. Let's go ahead and put it at 1/30th. We're going to try 1/30th. So we just made an exposure value change in stops from 1/100th to 1/30th. Always ask yourself what you just did with the shutter speed. From 1/100th to 1/30th, you slowed the shutter speed down, which is allowing more light to come through. In this original example, we had a perfect exposure with these 3 settings, but now we made a change to this setting, so we need to make a change to either one of these or both, doesn't matter. But we need to find, let's go ahead and run this through really quickly. We need to find a change in stops. Let's go ahead and count it out. 1, every time we're doing a click on the dial, right? 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks is 3/3. That equals 1 full stop. Let's keep going. 1 more click, one more click, and we found 1/30th. So that was 2 clicks. So we made an exposure value change of 1 whole stop and 2/3, 1 2/3 of a stop, okay? That means we need to come out over here, and we just added more light to the exposure, which if we were to take it, it would be overexposed. So we need to remove light. Our ISO is at 100. To remove light on the ISO, you need a lower ISO number. Most of your cameras cannot go below 100. So we can't make that change to the ISO, right? So we need to make the change to the f-stop. We added more light by slowing down the shutter speed. That means we need to increase the amount of light by changing the f-stop. To increase the amount of light, what do we do to the opening? We have to make it larger. Go back to the triangle or one of those settings. How do you make, what setting makes it larger? A smaller number makes the opening larger. So we need to find 1 2/3 of a stop. Let's go ahead and count this out. 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks. That's 1, 1, and 2. 2/3 of a click. So we just found 1. Sorry, my hand, I'm writing with my mouse. It's terrible. All right, let's go ahead. A lot of your lenses can't get to f3.2. If you can't get there, if you can't have more light, right? Let's say you can only get to 4. That's 1, 2, 3/3 of a click. From 5.6 to f4 is 1 whole stop. Let's say your lens only allows you to get to f4.0. We still need to find 1 stop, or 2/3 of a stop, I'm sorry. We need to find 2/3 of a stop somewhere else. That means we have to go to our ISO and go 2/3 of a stop, which is from 100, 1 click, 125, 1 more click, 160, that's 2/3 of a stop. So we would have to make our ISO 160 to get a proper exposure, and then we would be able to show that motion at 1/30th of a second. I hope that makes sense. We're going to be going over a little bit more. I'm going to create another video on aperture and the effects of that next week. Feel free to practice, get out there, and shoot me an email. Remember, you can set up a Zoom meeting and we can go one-on-one, and I can go over some things with you if you're struggling, if you're falling behind, and if you don't understand anything, okay? Please feel free to think of anything that you could photograph for this showing motion assignment, like a fire truck at night even. You can do this at night when there's low light. It's a lot easier to show that motion and get a proper exposure because you're going to be doing a slower shutter speed. An ambulance, or maybe you've got a friend who likes skateboarding or mountain biking or surfing, although that wouldn't be too great. Just think of anything fun that would make a really interesting composition, okay? For both. Showing, for this assignment, you got to show motion and stop motion. Those of you with an iPhone, try it at nighttime. Try shooting something at nighttime because your iPhone will slow down your shutter speed in order to get a proper exposure, and you'll be able to do that. In order to show motion, we're going to use the panning technique. The panning technique is coming up right after this.